We hope to be joined by Issa McVeigh and then by the Conservative Nick Bowes before 8 o'clock. Nick Bowes is the backbench MP. He's turned into something of a central figure in plans to allow Parliament to take greater control of the Brexit process. So all that's coming up. We have to say farewell to Vince and to Vicky. I think has to go and do lots of other things. And as they do that, I sat down with the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who said that the only way out of the political crisis after Tuesday night's vote was a second referendum.
There's a case for a second referendum in any event. I mean, even if the negotiation had gone reasonably well, because then you could compare what we had with what we're going to get. But I think the case is obviously much stronger now because we're in a complete mess. Parliament is essentially deadlocked. I don't think there's a majority in Parliament for any form of Brexit. And we've got different versions of Brexit on offer. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say, look, in those circumstances, we're best to go back to the people.
But it suits you that the May deal has gone down in flames, doesn't it? Because it improves, you would think, the chances of a second vote.
Yeah, but I think the important thing is to realise why it's gone down in flames. And, you know, I understand there's a huge desire with the public who say, we voted for it, why don't you get on with it, just get the job done, what are you guys still squabbling about? And the truth is, the reason why her deal went down is because MPs studied the detail and they realised it was a bad deal, and it is a bad deal. It's a bad deal for many different reasons, but the principal one is that despite the undertaking that was given, that the future relationship with Europe would be clear, the future relationship with Europe is not clear, and even the cabinet is divided about what it should be. And the reason people voted the deal down was because to leave in those circumstances is actually dangerous for the country.
But you don't really have an interest in her trying to put the show back on the road, her consultations, trying to improve the deal. I mean, you would prefer just to go to a second referendum. The deal doesn't really matter to you.
Well, I would prefer to go for a second referendum, yes, of course. But on the other hand, I acknowledge the fact that if Parliament comes to a consensus around Brexit, it's going to be much harder to do that.
But you'd still want a second referendum, whatever happens.
Yeah, I think there's a very strong case for that, because I think given the mess, given everything that's happened, given the circumstances we find ourselves in, to ask the people to think again is not unreasonable. So yes, of course, I would argue that in any event. But the practical reality is that if Parliament's blocked, that is the only option other than no deal. And the one thing you can't say is that people back in June 2016 voted to crash out of Europe without a deal. I mean, I don't know how the Brexiteers could argue that case.
People think that you've been telling European leaders, and you've seen them a lot, don't be generous, strike a tough deal. The Brits won't like that. A bad deal makes it more likely we can reverse all this Brexit nonsense with a second referendum. That's what people think. Is that proper behaviour for a former Prime Minister?
It wouldn't be very sensible to say that to them. And by the way, I absolutely haven't. I haven't needed to say that to them, even if I want to do, which I don't particularly. And by the way, you know, I'm a former Prime Minister. They're listening primarily to the government. What they've said to me is, we keep explaining to the British government these are the choices, and then they keep going away and coming back with the same cake and eat it. So insofar as I've had conversations with European leaders more recently, it's been to say to them, and this has really been my point, okay, I think it's possible the British people may be given another choice. You may think that's impossible, and for a long time, by the way, they did think that's impossible.
You've been encouraging them to think that a second referendum is possible.
I've said to them, I believe it is possible. But I have to tell you, until a very short time ago, they said, well, I'm sorry, we've looked at it and we can't see that.
But if that surely encourages them not to give Mrs May a good deal. The better the deal, the less likely a second referendum, or if there was one, the more likely the British will vote for it. Bad deal, we can overturn it in a second referendum. That's been the message.
I'd love to think I was that powerful, but well, no.
I mean, in December, you said, this is in reference to getting European leaders on track for a second referendum, to understand it's a real possibility. You said, I need to get the European leaders to the next stage. It's almost as if you're inserting yourselves into the negotiations.
No, I'm not inserting myself into the negotiation, but I'm expressing my point of view, which I've expressed publicly all the way through. which obviously I would prefer
But that
to...
makes you a player in the negotiations then.
Well,
The Prime Minister's trying to do a deal, you're going to European leaders, you're saying, hey, look, the second referendum, it's a rising possibility. At one stage, you think they need to realise that it's a probability that's going to happen, and they should prepare for it. If
So
that's not interfering in the Brexit process, what is? Some people would think, for a former Prime Minister, this is unpatriotic.
How is it unpatriotic if you think that Brexit's a really bad idea for the country and you think another referendum is in the interest of the country? It's not patriotic to express
that's
it.
fine. You're entirely, as other former Prime Ministers do, to say what you want to say and take whatever view, but not to insert yourselves in the negotiations.
I'm not inserting myself in the negotiation, Andrew. I don't have the power to do that. But I am making it clear to them that if we're in a situation where Britain may think again, they should think again.
It's not me that's saying, and people may also have the wrong impression, but Theresa May certainly thinks so. She said in December, for Tony Blair to go to Brussels and seek to undermine our negotiations by advocating a second referendum is an insult to the office he once held and the people he once served. What do you say to that? She thinks it.
I know. Look, it's like when she steps out on Downing Street yesterday evening and says, it's time people put aside self-interest and address the national interest. We just have a different understanding of what the national interest is. These MPs who are voting down her deal, and they're not voting it down because I'm telling them to vote it down, but
I understand that.
Right. They're voting it down because they don't think it's in the national interest, and I agree with them. So rather than, I don't think that Theresa May's unpatriotic to be trying to do Brexit, and she shouldn't think I'm unpatriotic for trying to stop it. It's a disagreement, happens in politics, and it's happening over
So you are trying to stop it?
Well, of course, I'm completely
trying to
against
stop it with the second referendum?
I have said right from the outset, my view is if we can reverse Brexit, we should, but we can't do it unless we do it through a vote of the people, and secondly, unless we address the underlying problems.
You've been campaigning, as I say, for a second vote for some time now. Why has the case made so little headway with the leadership of your own party?
Well, that's a good question. Let me answer it diplomatically.
No, answer it bluntly, please, and straightforwardly.
Okay, but look, first of all, I think there are perfectly understandable reasons why people are sceptical about a second referendum. You know, I think this is why I don't disrespect the people who are saying, oh, please, no, we're going to go through all this again, we're going to have another vote. I understand it completely. It's just that I think when you really go through all the different options, what you'll find is the only way of bringing closure to this debate is to go back to the people. So one part of the Labour leadership is a general hesitation that isn't just confined to the Labour leadership. Okay. The other thing is, I think, you know, there is an anxiety amongst parts of the Labour leadership. Some of them may be actually more pro-Brexit, frankly. But there's an anxiety that you will offend Leave voters in Labour seats, and I understand that.
You've said before that before any second referendum, and I quote you, Europe should step forward with a series of measures that would allow people in Britain to understand and be listened to on free movement. What public utterances have we heard from Berlin, Brussels, Paris, that would indicate we're being listened to?
Right, so one of the things I think we should understand is that, as I was saying before, 30 months have taught us a lot about Brexit, but the last 30 months have seen a convulsion in European politics. So that has been principally over exactly the same issues that gave rise to Brexit. And one of those issues is immigration. It's sometimes thought in the UK that freedom of movement was only an issue for the British, not an issue more generally in Europe. This is not true.
You've proposed an emergency brake on EU migration. That's what David Cameron tried to get and failed. Angela Merkel had ruled it out. President Macron doesn't like it. I can't see any public statement of any leading European that would substantiate they're going in the direction you're talking about.
So I think if it becomes, as it were, a real issue because you are going to have another vote, then look, I may be wrong, but from my conversations, I believe they would step forward and you would have such an offer. Now, for me, staying in Europe is not conditional on that, but...
Have they given you private reassurances?
They're not in a position to give assurances, But let me put it in this way. The discussion I've had with various leaders, and I'm not going to go into which leaders at what time because it's not appropriate, but the discussions I've had indicate to me that they understand this is also an opportunity for Europe to make certain reforms itself. And, you know, if you look, for example, at what President Macron has said over these last months about reform in Europe, one element of that is acknowledging that there are issues, you know, deep-seated European issues that have got to be dealt with.
And his reform programme is pretty much dead in the water.
His reform programme in Europe, you mean?
For Europe.
I'm not sure about that. I think I think you can get agreement on certain aspects of that. And I think as you go forward, by the way, two things are going to be very obvious in Europe. One, you've got to deal with this immigration question. And two, there's going to be a different level of integration of those in the Eurozone and those outside it.
And we would remain outside it because he used to want us in it at one stage.
No, I never proposed putting us in it. I always thought we should be able to do it if we want to do, but we should...
You wanted us in it.
No. I actually always made it clear. The politics might go one way, but the economics had to be right, and they never were for us.
You've said that if a second referendum would bring closure to the matter, whatever the result, it would bring closure. Are you really telling me that if this country voted 51 to 49 to remain, that would bring closure?
I think, this is my view, I think you need an agreement before the referendum takes place. Both sides, absolutely clear. Whatever the majority, at the end of it, that's the end of it.
That's what the government told the British people. No, that's referendum.
But now we've had 30 months of negotiation. Let's be very clear. Back in June 2016, and this has always been the problem, we knew the home we wanted to leave. We didn't know the home we were going to. Now we've got to fight. I mean, everyone's knowledge is enlarged as to what Brexit means and what the implications are. So I think you need, this is why it has got to bring closure. And, you know, for most members of the British public, they're desperate to get this issue off the table.
Mr. Blair, 51-49 for Remain after 52-48 to leave would not bring closure.
Well, it depends what you agree beforehand.
Don't you fear that a second referendum would do even more damage to public faith in politicians than the Iraq war?
Look, I don't think, first of all, I think they're completely different issues, but secondly, I think that for the public, this is a terribly difficult situation. Whatever we're going to do, by the way, is going to be problematic. And one of the things I say to people is, yes, I agree, there will be people who are outraged if you have another vote. But by the way, we go the other side of March 2019, and nothing's resolved, and a year later we're still arguing about it. You're going to find a swathe of people, particularly young people, who feel their future's been sold down the river. I can tell you from my interactions with some of them, they're going to be very angry. So there's no solution in this that's ideal. But we're asking the people, you know, we're not asking a different people, we're asking the British people. And we're asking them in circumstances where let's accept, I mean, everyone accepts this thing's a complete damn mess. Okay, everyone will agree with that. When you're going back to the people in those circumstances, I think this is, my sense of this is, even though it seems counterintuitive, people will accept that it's the only way through and will accept it brings closure.
Our parliament has been, and I think we could both say thankfully, free of the sort of extremists that we now see in the French Assembly, or the German Bundestag, or the parliaments of Italy, or of most of the countries in Eastern Europe. Do you not fear that if you get your way, you will unleash the very same forces in Britain?
I don't think so, personally. But I tell you what I believe is necessary, because I don't think you can be held hostage, by the way, to doing what you think is right by these extremes. I mean, you know, when I have people say to me, oh, well, look, Tommy Robinson, people will be very angry. I mean, we're going to take our decisions on this basis. So
these are people who voted in good faith for one way, and you're trying to get them to vote again.
That's true, but
that's what would do it, not the Mr. Robinson.
I know, but you're asking them to vote again. It's not as if you're saying we're just going to do this without your consent. The British people are going to give their consent or not. However, one of the things that I have said constantly to people inside the kind of Remain and pro-Europe camp is to say we cannot do this unless we show we know what the underlying concerns are and prepared to deal with it. And that is particularly so on these issues of cultural alienation and identity and communities left behind. But the truth of the matter is, none of these issues are made better by Brexit. And one of the things that is so tragic about this, as we were sort of hinting at, both of us earlier, is that whilst the big problems of the country go unaddressed, here we are debating Brexit. And Brexit, in a world that's changing so fast, it's literally the answer to nothing.
What are the chances in your mind of you getting a second referendum?
Well, I think they're up to 50%.
That much?
Yeah, I do, because I think that I can't see people voting for a painful Brexit, which is hard Brexit. I can't see them voting for a pointless Brexit, which is the sort of Norway option. And you know, in the old Sherlock Holmes dictum, when you exclude the impossible, what remains, however improbable, is the answer. So that's why I think it's you know, I'm more confident than I was, and I don't for a minute underestimate the difficulties of it, by the way. But I think if we tumble out of the European Union without a clear idea of where we want to go, I ask MPs and people just to think not April 2019, but April 2020, April 2021, and we're still arguing about the same things in Brexit. People are going to go crazy if we're in that situation. And the only way you're going to bring this to an end is to say, come on, do you want to really leave or do you want to stay? Take the decision, and then you can move on. Because then, by the way, you say 51-49 remain, let's put it round the other way and say it's 51-49 leave. People like myself in those circumstances, that's the end of it. We get on, we try and make the damn thing work. Do I want it? No. I think it's a mistake. But if it really is the settled will of the people after all of this, after 30 months of negotiation and all this mess, if that is what people want to do, then we've got to carve a new future for ourselves. And we've just all got to get behind that. But we're not going to get behind it until we really, really know that's what people want to do.
Tony Blair speaking to me earlier.